This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. I also write the Vietnam Weekly newsletter, which you can find at vietnamweekly.substack.com, so go check that out. Vietnam, at this point, is well known as a tech hotspot, something I've had an episode on before, whether it's startups working to get off the ground or companies basing coding teams here or something in between. There are many sectors within the tech scene, and one that feels often overlooked by both investors and consumers compared to the likes of fintech or e-commerce, which have household names like Momo and Shopee, is climate tech. The data backs this up as well, which you'll hear about in this episode. This is despite climate change being the defining challenge of our time, I would argue, and for many decades to come. Vietnam, as we know, is highly exposed to climate impacts, as evidenced by the record-breaking damage caused by Typhoon Yagi last month. But at this point, you may be asking yourself, what exactly is climate tech? Today's guest is Jason Lusk, managing partner at Clickable Impact and co-author of the recently released Vietnam Climate Tech Funding Ecosystem Report 2024. We discussed why Clickable Impact and New Energy Nexus created this first-of-its-kind report, what climate tech means in the Vietnam context and why funding for it has lagged behind the country's other tech sectors, areas of climate tech poised for growth, and what stakeholders in this space can do to ensure further growth. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest ideas, get in touch at matatarski@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Jason. Jason, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Great to be here.
So we're here today talking about the Vietnam Climate Tech Funding Ecosystem Report, which was just released on this Monday, September 30th, which, full disclosure, I was pretty involved with kind of early on, like a year ago, and then changed a lot, but I did play some role in this. But just to get started, what is climate tech, at least kind of within the parameters of this report?
A key question. Yeah, so there are a variety of different definitions that you'll see around, but they all point in the same direction. We used in this report Deal Room's definition, which is technology solutions aimed at tackling climate change and its environmental impacts. And that can be done by reducing greenhouse gas emissions or adapting systems to environmental changes.
Okay. So with that in mind, what did you and the partners and also involved in this, New Energy Nexus, Swiss EP, what did you guys hope to achieve through the creation of this report?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I should say that this was very much a labor of love for us. New Energy Nexus and Clickable Impact started talking about doing this report about a year and a half ago. And we did a little roadshow to raise funding for it and did get a generous contribution from Swiss EP, but it was pretty far from full funding for the exercise. So we just decided to forge ahead and do it on our own. And we did that because we think it's such important research to do. Clickable Impact, my company, is all about green and inclusive economic development. And we've always been fascinated by how private investors and private business can be incentivized to support the public good. But the challenge is that private investors and private businesses are amoral. I fundamentally believe that. There are good people in business and there are good people in investment, but their behavior can be best understood as amoral. They follow the money. That's their primary incentive. Even impact investors, and we talked to them in this report, even impactors were telling us that while they were driven by purpose, they would still prioritize profit. They weren't going to invest in a climate tech startup out of charity. That climate tech startup needed to be able to generate 10x to 100x returns over the life of the investment. So if we want to leverage private businesses and investors to drive climate action, we have to think in terms of a system. Right? And if you know anything about systems thinking, there are always inputs and outputs of the system. And in a market-driven system, the most critical input is money. So for this report, we started with a very simple question. We asked, Vietnam needs to make these massive investments in order to become more resilient to climate change. How can we bring more money to the table? And at the same time, New Energy Nexus, I don't know how much you know about New Energy Nexus, they're a fabulous organization. They incubate early stage climate tech startups and are really one of the primary ecosystem builders for climate tech. So both Clickable and New Energy Nexus wanted to bring that money to the table in a way that ignited and embraced this wonderful entrepreneurial spirit that we have here. It's really one of Vietnam's superpowers. So that was the reason for the focus on early stage startups in climate tech. Our goal is to provide a roadmap for investors and a fundraising guide for startups. And we hope that by doing that, we can drive more private sector investment into this field. And no one had done that yet.
Yeah, which is something we've talked about, how it can be hard to, find kind of condensed information on a given topic or sector or something like that. And yeah, I guess climate tech is not something you hear about as much. Vietnam has this well-earned reputation at this point as kind of a startup hub. A lot of startups are coming out of Vietnam, both founded by Vietnamese or foreigners who live here, or a mix of the two. But yeah, I mean, according to the report, since 2015, which I guess is the first deal within the kind of parameters was struck in between 2015 and 2023, there was 92.6 million in climate tech funding, which kind of by the standards of startup funding is not very much over the course of, 8 years. So I guess in terms of attention and both actual numbers is lagging a bit. Why do you think that is compared to, you hear a lot more about, fintech or health tech or things like that? Why is this not getting as much attention from investors and I guess the average person?
Well, I think you need to remember that climate tech is not something that we didn't really talk seriously about globally until a decade ago, maybe a little bit more than a decade. And why a decade ago? That's when the cost of technologies like solar, wind, drone technology, satellite data, AI really started to drop, putting climate solutions within reach of cash strapped innovators who wanted to build new solutions. Before that, there was climate tech. In the early 2000s, I did a lot of work for a big energy efficiency company called Johnson Controls, but these were big multi-billion dollar companies. Siemens and Schneider Electric would be two better known examples around Vietnam. So it was the plummeting cost of these technologies a decade ago that enabled a climate tech ecosystem globally. And then we saw this surge of entrepreneurial activity that resulted between 2018 and 2022, really massive growth, like a gold rush in global investment in climate tech. To the point where climate tech made up about 10% of total global investment in startups during that period. It was interesting how quickly it all changed. I was part of a small team from 2019 to 2022 that helped design and launch something called ADB Ventures, which was the venture capital arm, is the venture capital arm of the Asian Development Bank. And our aim was to fill what we saw as a gap in climate tech investment in Asia, an unmet need. But really, by the time we operationalized and started deploying capital in 2020, the private sector had already jumped in, and we found ourselves actually competing for deals with private sector investors, which had not been the original intention of ADB Ventures. So, anyways, a lot of global activity, but that global activity is pretty recent, just last decade. Vietnam was late to that party, but you would expect it to be late. About 76% of existing climate tech startups, the ones that are still alive today, were founded after 2019. But once that ecosystem got started in Vietnam, it grew super fast. Investment in climate tech startups in Vietnam increased 365% year on year from 2021 to 2023, which is really just phenomenal growth.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess it is worth pointing out a bit that there are some of that percentage consists of a few fairly large deals involving a small handful of companies, some of which are almost, if not household names, at least well known, especially Dat Bike and Celex, kind of on the mobility side, both make electric motorbikes for different segments, but Celex.
They're not the biggest, right? So Dot Bike has raised a Series A. Select has raised a Series A, but they didn't do it within the period that we covered in this report, which is 2015 to 2023. Select is coming on the heels of them. Actually, the largest deals were for some logistics companies that may not be household names to people listening to this podcast, like Logivan and Alternative Protein. Alternative proteins have raised a lot of capital in Vietnam. This is a very popular subcategory of climate tech in China. I wouldn't have expected it to be as big here, but there are two, Cricket One Asia and Entebel, that raised Series A rounds. And Entebel went on to raise a Series B, a $33 million Series B. And they're only one of two companies in Vietnam to reach that.
Yeah, it is fascinating how those two, Cricket One, they've been on, Vicky Nguyen, co-founder, has been on the podcast before. Fascinating story. Yeah, like you mentioned, Entobel. Yeah, I mean, great how those have come out of here, but also, I suppose, not what you would have expected. But yeah, so those two sectors, I think it's farming and food production, Entobel and Cricket One specifically, and then mobility, Logivan, like you mentioned, Dat Bike. So those two have made up something like 80% of all the funding, climate tech funding. So obviously those are pretty well established, at least around those companies. But what other kind of subsectors within climate tech do you think could be kind of the next one to break out?
That's an interesting question. So the mobility startups have done very well. Alternative proteins as a subset of farming and food production have done well. I think that there will continue to be investment and innovation in those two areas. I don't see them slowing down. Where I am hearing a lot of excitement is around blue economy. So solutions that leverage our ocean-based resources. Just think about this long S-shaped coast that Vietnam has, and it's really perfect for seaweed farming, for tidal energy, and for all the climate positive applications that can come out of both of those technologies. And I know that there are a lot of entrepreneurs that are working on early stage solutions in those areas. I know a couple of them. Another area to watch is carbon trading. There's a lot of excitement around the carbon economy globally. There's a lot of excitement around the carbon economy in Vietnam. I sit next to a carbon trader all day in the Sunhua Innovation Space where we have our office in Saigon. But there are a couple of things holding back the carbon economy in Vietnam. One is just the state of the voluntary carbon market globally. It's struggling. It's been a little bit stagnant in the last couple of years. And the other is that Vietnam has a timetable for implementing compliance market and exchange trading system for carbon by 2028. And everybody's sort of waiting to see what's going to happen. Finally, I think that there's a lot of untapped potential in the circular economy. Our report found more startup activity than investment in circular economy. There's a sort of imbalance, lots of companies, not much investor interest in it. And our analysis of that is that there's been a lot of effort by grant making bodies, donor funded programs, and that sort of thing to jumpstart entrepreneurship on the circular economy through innovation challenges and incubators and other funded programs. But look, I think that investors will come around. I keep talking with entrepreneurs who have these really exciting and seemingly extremely innovative solutions for valorizing waste product. I just talked with somebody yesterday who's not necessarily a startup founder and is actually pretty well known, but he's taking shrimp heads and shrimp tails and using everything in that waste product to turn it into some kind of useful product and returning only water to nature. So, that's the kind of exciting application you can find in the circular economy space. And I think we're going to see a lot more.
Yeah, those definitely make sense to me. I mean, I mostly line up with a lot of government goals or initiatives as well. I know I think government has something like they want to produce 500,000 tons of seaweed or something like that by, let's say, 2030. I don't remember the year off the top of my head. But yeah, I know there's companies working on that in various aspects. I wrote a freelance story about one last year that's trying to figure out how to grow seaweed to feed to livestock because a study is showing that it can mostly eliminate methane emissions. Working on that. Yeah, obviously hear plenty about the circular economy. Should probably do an entire episode about the carbon market at some point. You see a lot about it, Vietnam's forests and all that stuff, but we shall see. But in terms of the report, was there anything that particularly, surprised you or really jumped out at you in terms of the findings from it?
Did it surprise me or didn't it surprise me? We talked about the rate of growth in the ecosystem, and that has been exciting to see. I'm also a little bit surprised that there are some climate techs that have grown to a state of maturity where they can raise a Series B. We talked about that already. But I guess on the other side of the coin, things are still a little bit lethargic. I mentioned that globally speaking, there was this gold rush that took place between 2018 and 2022. Climate tech entrepreneurship was just the thing to do. It was the hot category. And against that backdrop, the fact that there are only 49 extant startups in climate tech in Vietnam that we're able to find, there may be more than that. I should say that our report only covered those that have publicly disclosed funding, but only 49 funded startups in climate tech in Vietnam. In a country of 100 million people during this boom time in climate tech globally, that was surprising, maybe even a little bit disappointing. But look, I think that the ecosystem is catching up fast. 10% of startup investment globally is going towards climate tech. It's now 4% in Vietnam. I think the gap is closing very quickly. Part of what we want to do with this report, by the way, is set that waterline, so benchmark the level of climate tech investment in Vietnam so that we can track its growth over time And I wouldn't be surprised that we publish this report 5 years from now to find that Vietnam had caught up.
And just to provide, I guess, add a little bit of context, I mean, of course, listeners know the importance of climate change globally, but kind of in the Vietnam specific, why is climate tech or why should it be so important to the country moving forward?
There are two reasons. One is, I think, well known to anybody who lives and work here, which is that the carbon emissions from Vietnam are increasing dramatically with the growth of its economy. Industrial growth, growth in FDI, growth in automobile ownership. None of these things are inherently bad things, but they generate a lot of carbon. So, look, I mean, Vietnam is still responsible for far less than 2% of all greenhouse gas emissions globally, but its share is rising at a rapid clip. And a lot of that activity, or a lot of those emissions, are generated as part of export generating activities. And of course, there are lots of initiatives around the world. I think CBAM, the European Trade Regulation, being one of the better known ones to control carbon emissions in value chains that are reaching those key import markets. So whether or not we like it, there's going to be pressure on Vietnamese industry and on Vietnamese agriculture to take carbon out of production, and technology has to be part of that solution. The other reason why Vietnam should be investing in climate tech is that this is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change because so much of the country is in low-lying areas and is vulnerable to sea level rise because of the increasing frequency of natural disasters like Typhoon Yagi, which we just saw pummel the north a few weeks ago, because of increasing temperatures and heat, because of all sorts of points of vulnerability for Vietnamese agriculture to the effects of climate change. This is something that's going to have a very high cost to Vietnam in the long term if we don't find ways to mitigate it or adapt to it, would be the more technically accurate term to use in that case. But the World Bank estimates that in a do nothing scenario, climate change will cost Vietnam 14.5% of its GDP annually by 2050. That's a very, very high cost to pay. Clearly, there are some sensible investments we could be making in the short term to try and get that number lower.
Yeah. And I mean, also worth mentioning, which I think is in the report, but these two twin goals that the Vietnamese government has set for itself of becoming a high income country by 2050 and also achieving net zero emissions by 2045, which you could kind of place those two goals on the top of basically any topic you're talking about in modern Vietnam. And I mean, they're both outstanding goals, but as you just said, if climate change is taking points off GDP every year, that's going to be the high income goal will be hard to achieve.
Well, that's right. If your economic growth model is based on heavy industry and high carbon agriculture, like rice is a big methane emitter, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, then those appear to be contradictory goals. The only way to work your way out of the contradiction is through technology. And there are technologies that make industry cleaner and greener, and there are technologies that make agriculture cleaner and greener.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of the topic of the climate tech ecosystem, what advice would you, if someone's listening, either from the startup side or the investment side or something in the middle, what advice would you give to them?
I think for the investors, I would just say never bet against entrepreneurship and innovation in Vietnam. This is, by global or even regional standards, a relatively small startup ecosystem, but it tends to overperform. And I think that there will be some very interesting, very investable, very scalable solutions to come out of Vietnam that will have implications not just for this economy, but others around Southeast Asia. So we welcome more investors into the ecosystem. We think that there are good deals to be had here. And if anybody wants to have their hand held and guided through the ecosystem, both New Energy Nexus and Clickable Impact will be happy to help. For founders, for entrepreneurs, I would say focus on B2B solutions. I know that everybody gets passionate about sorting their garbage at home and filtering out the plastic bottles and using less air conditioning. Those solutions are hard to scale. Those consumer solutions are hard to scale. Focus on the B2B solutions. I believe that's where the real demand is going to be, especially as CBAM and other factors like it put pressure on manufacturers and growers to provide more sustainable and lower carbon products. So, focus on those B2B solutions. I would also look for opportunities to localize proven technology solutions that have commercialized successfully elsewhere, but localize those to Vietnam. There's huge potential in adapting these market validated technologies to local needs. One of the things that ADB Ventures found when I was working with that team is that entrepreneurs that have climate technology solutions that are successfully contributing to lower emissions in a market like India aren't necessarily in a big hurry to expand into a country like Vietnam. They have a big enough market at home. They might prioritize somewhat larger markets like Indonesia before they come to Vietnam. That creates an opportunity for our own entrepreneurs to take inspiration from those solutions or even license those solutions and create a market for them. So, look, I mean, for investors, finding that diamond in the rough is tough. For entrepreneurs, finding that right product market fit, problem solution fit is tough. But I think that we're just starting to see a very interesting wave of climate tech investment in Vietnam. And I think there's plenty of opportunity to surf that wave.
Something I hadn't brought up earlier is kind of government support or initiatives in the area. Obviously we hear a lot from the Vietnamese government about renewable energy as a whole. The country's kind of become a leader in Southeast Asia in that regard, especially on solar. But that's utility scale. Billions and billions of dollars involved in building out solar, or not to mention offshore wind and that kind of stuff. What are we seeing kind of from Vietnamese government in terms of supporting smaller scale, I suppose, climate tech?
There's a lot of government support for startups and entrepreneurship. There's not targeted support, as far as I know, for climate tech startups. But look, I think that the most important thing, the most valuable thing that the Vietnamese government could do for the climate tech ecosystem is just to be in dialogue with climate tech entrepreneurs and investors. I'm not in the business of recommending or dictating policy. I wouldn't presume to do that. But we're in a time of rapid change, including rapid policy change. Entrepreneurs, if they know what's coming, they'll come up with ways to innovate and develop business models around it. So if the government can provide a heads up on the direction that it's headed with policy, its priorities, that's valuable information to entrepreneurs, and it's information that they can use to create value and to build great companies. Similarly, if entrepreneurs are able to share the obstacles that they're facing and the struggles that they're facing in the marketplace with government, I'm sure that government will hear them out and may have solutions to those problems.
Okay, kind of moving towards a conclusion. And speaking of dialogue, I know it's only been a couple of days since the report came out, but you mentioned, the goal moving forward is for this to kind of be a hopefully annual benchmark for the climate tech ecosystem. What kind of response have you been hearing since it was released?
We've heard a lot of excitement about this report. It's actually kind of surprising. You work on something for a year and a half and you lose sight of what a big deal it is. But I've had a lot of people in the ecosystem reach out to me since we released the report on Monday, express support for it, share ideas for potential sources of funding going forward. So look, I feel very optimistic that people are going to find this report useful. I know some entrepreneurs and investors that are already consulting it for ideas. And I think that we'll succeed in our goal in making this an annual exercise.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. It was a very interesting read and great way to learn about some companies that I consider myself fairly well informed on Vietnam, but some companies I hadn't heard of, learning more about others like that I'm pretty familiar with. I'll be sure to include a link to the report in the show notes. But yeah, Jason, thanks so much for coming on the show.
It's been a pleasure to be here, Mike. And when you buy your DOT bike, drive it over.
That's it for this episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Connect with the Vietnam Weekly on Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. Please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform. I'm taking the next few weeks off for a trip, so I'll be back in your feed either later this month or in early November. So I'll see you then.